Thank you. I have the disadvantage. You remember that teacher who used to come just before games? I'm here to present a study on both gender diversity, economic uncertainty, and bank risk taking as we get evidence from data from the Kenyan banking industry. So, to motivate the study, we know that one of the major functions of banks is risk transformation. However, there are times when they have been accused of excessive risk-taking, and a case in point is 2008. And in fact, from the experience of 2008, the beginning of this year, there was a scare when the SVP bank went, there was a bank run on the Silicon Valley Bank, but I think somehow we seem to have learned from 2008, so it did not spill over to become an economic crisis. And because of this, stakeholders are often interested to understand what drives bank risk preferences? What determines the bank risk taking? Of course, this question has been analyzed over and over, but it's still not yet settled. And so, drawing inspiration from that, this particular paper explores two of the hypothesized drivers of bank risk taking. One of them is both gender diversity and also economic uncertainty. So the recent debate on both gender diversity, there's been a debate in the recent years whether having more women on banks' boards is an effective corporate governance mechanism of reducing excessive bank risk taking. And the argument underlying this debate comes from some behavioral studies that indicate that there seems to exist gender-based behavioral differences in risk taking, or at least in risk preferences. And more specifically, that women are more conservative and risk averse compared to men, as they exhibit less risk behavior in major strategic and financial decisions. But why would, so what are some of the claims made or experimental evidence as to why women are more risk averse? There are quite a number of them. For example, literature from psychology indicates that, interestingly, when women when faced with challenging situations, whereas women tend to feel fear, men tend to be angry. I don't know how true that is. And in terms of gambling, the literature suggests that when women fear, they take to discount gambles, so they do not like to take gambles, but men will attach higher probability of success from the gambles. The second argument is the so-called challenge threat view, that men will look at risky situations or as a challenge to take on, whereas women will interpret risk as a threat to be avoided. And lastly, there's also a recent strand of the literature which says that individuals who possess power tend to focus primarily on positive outcomes. It's called approach behavior, while individuals with less power tend to focus on the negative side of the outcomes, the inhibition behavior. So and of course there is literature that indicate that men in society tend to have more power than women. Okay, I don't know how true that is. In fact, for a time I was thinking I'm presenting this in Parliament to support a third agenda rule, but anyway. So based on this, therefore, the hypothesis, therefore, is that female directors who are assumed to be less powerful will focus on negative attributes of the risk activities and therefore go for less risk undertaking, whereas men might take on risks and therefore banks that have a majority of men might, be more risk taking. Now, empirical literature on this is still mixed in terms of there are other studies that indicate yes, indeed it's true, but others indicate otherwise, and others really are quite neutral. So, for example, one study poses this question that could it be that the women who rise to the rank of executive actually are not, their risk taking is no different from those of men, and probably that's why they have really risen. So perhaps the argument that the gender difference might not come up. So this paper provides some evidence from the Kenyan banking industry. Probably, to the best of my knowledge, I didn't see any work on this, and so I thought it would be interesting to gain insights on this important area. Quickly on the macroeconomic uncertainty, there is a lot of work on uncertainty on real economic activity. However, not much exists specifically on the banking response to uncertainty. There are at least two transmission mechanisms. One is the real option view, which simply says that when the uncertainty is elevated, banks will wait until the uncertainty is resolved. So they won't take risk, they will, and the risk here is really lending. And so if they don't lend, when uncertainty is high, then we might, then that means they are risk averse when there is uncertainty. But there is another channel that indicates that during uncertainty, of course, economic agents will tend to save more, so there will be more supply of loanable funds. But also there is low demand from firms who have to wait and see until the uncertainty is resolved, which means therefore that the lending rates will go down. But since banks have still to meet the expectations of shareholders, which tends to be sticky perhaps in the short run, they will want to pursue the same target that they are required and therefore take more risk. So there are two opposing views, and so we consider this to be an empirical issue. In terms of data, we have data from 21 banks, and now you might ask, there are more banks than this. But of course, the reason is we had to get the gender diversity by hand collecting it from annual reports, which and some banks do not have consistent data for the period, for this period. And actually even the period was chosen because that's the time when we have some reasonable, not reasonable, but good enough data to allow for some parametric analysis. In terms of to measure economic uncertainty, we use this World Uncertainty Index, which if okay, yeah, I can explain it here. So For risk-taking, we use 4 measures, because ideally risk-taking is not, perhaps I couldn't say not observable, so we have to use proxies. And so we use 4 common proxies: non-performing loan, Z-score, deposit to loans. In fact, this comes very close to the, if strictly the risk-taking. How much loans do you give out of your deposits? And then of course we have the regulator risk-weighted asset. Risk-weighted asset, yeah. So the key explanatory variables, I'll just, so both gender diversity as a baseline model, we just use the percentage of women on bank boards. But of course we have some, I think 2 other proxies as robustness checks later on. And then economic uncertainty is just a text mining based measure which simply counts the frequency of the word uncertainty. So the Economist magazine runs this, and so this is where the index is constructed from. And it's available, I think, now on a quarterly basis. And it goes back, I think, to around 1960s, if I'm not wrong, to current. And so it's, this is one, because measuring uncertainty is not easy. If you look throughout the literature, you will find some will, find the volatility of macroeconomic variables. But I believe that this is one of the innovations in terms of measuring economic uncertainty. So, so in terms of the empirical model, we have a simple panel regression with risk-taking on the left-hand side, and the key variables there are uncertainty and gender diversity measures. So, just to quickly mention, in terms of NPLs, over the sample period was about 10, or they're about 10 to 11%. But of interest is the gender diversity. So on average, the bank executive boards had 19% of women. Of course, the maximum was about 50%. The lowest was 0. So if you know that is your bank, you see me after. Now, in terms of, but the good news is that there has been progress. Actually, over the period 2010 and about 2022, the percentage roughly on average had risen from about less than 13%. Actually, it had almost doubled to about 26%. So which means really there is good progress. However, that, of course, that's aggregate. In terms of individual, we have 20% of our observations had 0 entries. And that's maybe the worrying part of the distribution, but generally there is some good progress on this. In terms of the evolution of uncertainty, just to point out what was interesting from this was that uncertainty spikes during elections. So much of the economic uncertainty in Kenya over this sample period was due to political cycles. And indeed it was, so exact. You can see the dark shaded rectangles there are the years during election. So in terms of our baseline, uncertainty increases NPLs, lowers the Z-score, which means it compromises the bank stability. Also in terms of de-risk, this was the deposit to loans. So in other words, in terms of gender, we see that banks that have a higher proportion of women in their boards tend to have less NPLs, although statistically the evidence is weak. In terms of Z-score, they tend to be more stable. They tend to be liquid, which means less risk-taking. And then you can see the risk-weighted asset, although not really statistically significant. So of course, so that means that uncertainty increases bank risk, whereas gender, diversity, the evidence from the data we have is that it lowers bank risk. So of course, for the sake of time, I'll not go into the robustness checks, but in the paper we provide other measures of really gender diversity, and the evidence, the empirical results are qualitatively similar. So I'll just go to, and just to mention, one of the robustness is endogeneity. There are several reasons why risk and gender diversity could be, there could be a feedback relationship or reverse causality, and so we control for that and run a dynamic panel, which confirms our baseline results. So for the sake of time, I'll not go into that. So in conclusion, the evidence from this paper indicates that women in bank boards in Kenya, number one, is low. The sample average of about 19%, although there has been a progress rising from about 13% to about 26%. Number two, the paper concludes that increasing women directors in banks boards helps in reducing excessive bank risk-taking and promotes bank stability. Number three, economic uncertainty in Kenya fluctuates considerably, and also that elevated uncertainty is mostly driven by political election cycles. And then also bank risk increases with economic uncertainty. So in terms of policy reflections, regulators can curtail excessive risk by perhaps imposing gender quotas in executive bank boards. This has happened, especially in European banks, and also prudent management of elections calculated to increase confidence of economic agents is important. Thank you.